After watching this episode, I feel a little bit bad about having complained to my dentist about my recent jaw pain because, do I have it good. Hello, interwebs, I hope you are all doing well, and I am here to review the latest episode and Season 1 finale of Daredevil Born Again, this episode titled Straight into Hell. And I will put this out right up front. This was a really, really strong finale to what has been an incredibly, at least in my opinion, uneven season. And I was actually really surprised by how well this episode managed to feel like it was a conclusion to everything that has gone on this entire season, even bringing back some elements that I had been worried that this show had kind of dropped or were going to sort of leave by the wayside and not directly tie back into the show, namely the stuff like the tying in the Punisher cops and the Punisher tattoo stuff that they were wearing in the early part of the season that we haven't really directly addressed. And so since it hadn't been really called out in the past few episodes, I was worried that we wouldn't be getting that, but we do very much get that here. So stuff like that, I feel like it's a credit to this show for, especially considering how mismatched it was behind the scenes, for making this episode feel so cohesive. And I think one of the strongest things that I can say about this finale before we get into the nitty-gritty is that while if you've been watching my reviews, it's probably no shock to you that I overall think this is a very, very uneven season. But this episode managed to make me feel incredibly excited for a season 2. Like, I got to the end of this episode and I was like, all right, let's go. Let's get the next episode going. Like, I was really pumped for it. And I am actually kind of disappointed that I don't just get to go right into season 2 and we're going to have to wait, 2 years or however long it's going to take between Marvel shows or just TV shows generally nowadays. It takes so damn long for even 9 episodes of a show to freaking come out. It sounds like they've already started filming season 2, so hopefully it won't be that long of a wait. We'll see. But yeah, this had me very, very excited, which is something that I would not have expected coming off of the rest of the season. Not that and I've said this before in other reviews, I didn't hate this season, but I found it to be okay. Just something I'm like, yeah, it's fine. It was a good way to spend an hour. This episode mixed with last episode actually was getting me excited to be like, all right, I am on board for next season. I want to see where this creative team, now that they have full control from front to back instead of having to sort of take over from someone else, what they're going to do with this show going forward. And I think that is probably the best thing you could ask for from the show after this season. So I think this is probably as good as it was going to get just in terms of my feelings on it as a whole. And I'm very pumped to see where it's going to go from here. That doesn't mean that there wasn't some, ups and downs that I have with this episode, but on the whole, this was really, really great. Starting off, I will say, just start off with one of my negatives, and then we'll get into a lot more of my praise. The opening scene where we get Vanessa talking to Poindexter and sort of convincing him to take on the job to kill Foggy at the beginning of this, that we saw at the beginning of the season. I get why it's there, but it sort of gives us the literal explanation of what her thinking was and what she was doing, getting to see Vanessa being sort of the mastermind behind the scenes. It is a weird framing for the episode, though, given this is information that we already have, and Poindexter and him having been to a degree emotionally manipulated by her, it doesn't become relevant for any of the rest of the episode. So it really just becomes a framing of Vanessa's just as smart and clearly as manipulative as we've seen her be to Fisk over the many seasons of the show. She's able to sort of emotionally play his strings pretty well. It was sort of reiterating information that we already knew, both tangibly plot-wise from last episode, and then things that we already knew about Vanessa. She's smart. She's able to manipulate a lot of the men around her, and she's a very strong character and knows what she wants. So it's reiterating information. So I was sort of like, it's not a bad scene. It works fine. It's just an interesting framing that I think was a bit unneeded for the episode, which, me just saying it's a good scene, but it's unneeded, probably, and that's one of my bigger critiques. It was a good sign for the episode. But moving into the rest of the episode, I loved seeing the entire sort of Fisk plan coming into place now that he was dealing with, he was looking for a spark like this. I don't think this was his direct intent to be like, all right, this is the moment where I'm going to set this all in motion, but he had put everything in place and was waiting for that spark, as he talks about in one scene, and you just see all the dominoes starting to fall as his plan comes into place. And it is again, I was talking about this earlier, it is interesting to see how well the show is sort of picking up these threads that have been weaved throughout the season and making them feel very significantly paying off here. We get, for example, Daniel getting to blackmail the city council, which was a very fun scene. It's kind of very standard. It's one of those no, we're not going to blackmail you, but we certainly have some blackmail on you, but, just show up and we hope you'll have your support. Very standard scene, but getting to see Daniel come into that sort of like, I'm a little loyal fascist boy willing to do what I want for Fisk, do what Fisk wants for me, and like getting to feel like he has enjoying having power over people, feels like a good culmination of his arc throughout this whole season. Because he's not a competent character. He's a bully character who idolizes Fisk, and Fisk likes him because he's loyal. But he is willing to use power and sort of wield it over others, and that's one of the good things that he's good for. So it was nice to see a good culmination of his arc. And it was also really interesting to see Fisk's planner, I forget her name, but the sort of one who's been sort of dictating his schedule, I forget exactly her job title, see her ultimately protect herself and protect her job over actually standing up for what she believes in. Like, she has been framed as this character this whole season of being like someone who's kind of trying to speak a little bit of truth of like, this is how the system works, Fisk, this is what you're supposed to do as mayor. So you could see this moment where she has this moment like, I'm not loyal to you, Fisk, I'm standing up for what's right. And I really think it's actually a lot smarter that this show is sort of being like, she sees where the wind is blowing and she's going to throw the police chief under the bus so that she can get ahead. She's willing to sell him out to sort of keep her job because she sees like, oh, he's valuing loyalty. I'm going to show I'm loyal because I could get caught up and get killed in this too. But it also speaks to the cowardly nature of her. And it's interesting because it's very clear that Fisk is meant to sort of parallel to a degree the political climate, especially as we get to the end of the episode. Especially interesting that they filmed this, I think, probably before the recent election, the November election in the United States. So being sadly a little bit prophetic there. But it's interesting that is meant to sort of parallel sort of fascist strongmanian, if not necessarily one for one with Trump politics with Fisk. And we sort of see her being a coward, and it feels like a lot of what people critique Democrats right now for. Like, again, I'm not pulling it as like they intended this to be a one for one, but it is a similar dynamic of people being like, well, I'm not going to stand up. I'm going to go, like, I'm going to either think the system's going along as it's going to be, or I'm just going to like not say anything because I don't want to have my head on the chopping block next, which is also can be seen as sort of, now that I talk it out, it actually feels more like a Republican, like sort of like the centrist-y Republican types who are like, well, we're not going to speak out against Trump because our head will be on the chopping block. That actually kind of more fits where she is, but it's still in that sort of like, oh, we think the system's supposed to work, but you know what? We're going to let the fascists take over because I'm not going to be the one to stand up for him, up against him. And so I loved seeing that dynamic. And we see what happens with the police chief getting literally like just his face like smushed by Fisk, which was pretty intense and gory, if to say the least. But it is interesting to me because, I spoke about before, is the show going to go full ACAB? And there is a point here where I was like, wow, this is getting pretty close to it. Like, I think it's still implied when Fisk sort of declares martial law and we see these things of like them shooting a kid and then placing a mask on him and saying like, oh, it was a vigilante. Like basically like it felt like cops planting drugs on somebody to say like, oh, we're going to say he had drugs on him so that we can get away with whatever. Like, that is a dynamic that happens in the police force. And I think it's implied that those cops are still part of the task force, but we're getting a sense that these are going on all around the city. And we basically get the sense that this is just all kind of cops going along with this plan. So there is this element of like, yeah, the cops are just following along and using and enforcing state power. And since now the state is Fisk, they're willing to, hurt the citizens and attack the citizens as needed. It's not going so far as to say this is a systemic problem regardless of who's in power, as like cops, but there is an element of like there being that critique here. There's one note that I'll get to at the end of this that undercuts that, I think, a little bit, at the very end of this episode. But for the most part, I'm like, this isn't Disney going so far or Marvel going so far as to being like addressing all the systemic issues. I never thought that they were. So this is as close as they're getting. And I thought that that's pretty good. I thought that was a really strong depiction of all of that and them just falling into line under Fisk. I also really like that we get Vanessa and Fisk finally coming back together and being the power couple that they were back in the seasons 1 and I think 3 of Daredevil, because that was one thing that I did miss in their dynamic. Like, I understand why we have this arc with their characters, and now that we finally are like, all right, next season we're gonna get them both on the same team, they're both gonna be kicking ass, and that feels like such a strong thing to earn, because then it'd be like, all right, not only does Matt have to take on Fisk as he normally does, but he has to take on the team being fully back together, and being at the height of their power. So like the setup for them as a threat, both as individuals and as a couple, was really, I really, really adored that. I also adored the reveal of the why Fisk has been trying to get Red Hook sort of built up. The reveal that like Foggy found out that it was going to essentially be that it was a free port, and that Fisk basically wants to be able to create his own nation state there to be able to sell and launder whatever he wants to with Vanessa there, or Vanessa's sort of the one's been using it. So Vanessa's using it with Fisk, and he's been sort of planning to build that. So again, it sort of showcases that when fascists like people like him come into power, these sort of strong Manithorian types, they're not there because they love New York, as he says. They're there because they want to get what they want, and they're going to use whatever authority they have to be able to do it. They'll use the system as it helps them to get what they want, and if the system isn't helping them, they'll ignore it and tear it down to get to get theirs and to get their money, to get their power. And that's all Fisk wanted to do. I also will say I loved Vincent D'Onofrio. Like, he's always fantastic, but in this episode in particular, he was great. I loved when he's going up and like speaking about this. He's like, no, we need to set this city into martial law. I forget his exact line, but I love his like big like arm swings, and he's like getting really intense into it. Like, I was really enjoying his performance, and just him sort of reveling in like the power that he has and just getting really performative. It was very engaging and very, very fun. So pretty much everything on the Fisk side of this, just like seeing all the things come into line, was wonderful. Which also brings me over to the Matt side of things. We start off a little bit slow with him sort of escaping from the hospital. It's sort of like standard stuff that you would expect. But once we have Frank come back into this, boy, did this just keep going. I really enjoyed the fight sequences with him and Frank. Frank felt fully on form here. I was just like, I love the back and forth between Matt and Frank, of Matt being like, don't kill people. Like, this is not what we want to do. And Frank's like, what are you going to do? Try and tell me what to do? And he just starts murdering people, and Matt's trying to talk him down. But at the end of the day, I love that, like, when Matt goes up against the guy or finds the cop who killed Frank Ayala with the Punisher bullets, Matt just sort of like says, no, he's not worth it. And Frank calls him on it because he's like, look around you, dude. There's people dead all over your office. You're going to draw the line at this guy, the guy who did the worst thing? And I love Frank just going like, what, do you think he's worth it? And he just shoots the dude. That is nailing the Frank and Matt dynamic to a T. And I thought it was really great. And I love this like arbitrary moral line that Matt's putting in the sand of like, I'm not going to kill this guy, when all around you people are just dead. And like, I get the morals that Matt is trying to uphold. It's part of his character is like, I don't kill, and that line is sort of a big conflict for him in season 3 of the Netflix show. So it's just interesting to just see like Frank just calling out like, look around you, bro, look what's happening. Is this where you're weirdly drawing the line? So it's an interesting sort of difference in their styles, and that I thought was like a really fun conflict to play up, even though they're technically on the same side here. So all of that was great. And then Karen coming back into it. Not particularly shocked. Again, we all kind of knew that they reshot episode 1 and then, Satan 9 of this season. And part of that was bringing in Karen and also Foggy, as well as Poindexter and Frank, to a degree. And so like Karen coming back at the end here, just like Foggy and Frank kind of have, and Poindexter has not really particularly shocking, but it was really good to see her and her being sort of the moral voice for Matt, or not even the moral voice, the one who like the person who finds Matt, who understands Matt as a person. Not necessarily she has a stronger moral compass, but that she understands Matt and can sort of pull both Matt and Frank to themselves and sort of like get them thinking in a much more straightforward manner than sometimes they're dealing with all their own BS in their own brain, gets them through. So I liked her playing that role for both Matt and Frank, and her having called Frank and Frank being like, I did a favor for you, and she says thank you, and yeah, I appreciate that. But then this brings me to the other element of this that I like, which is Frank going up against the task force Punisher fanboys, and I love everything to do with that. I love they're like, hey Frank, we just want to talk, and he's like, yeah, and then he just starts murdering all of them. Wonderful. Very Frank Castle. And I love when they capture him and they're like, hey, we idolize you, man. We love using your tactic. Essentially, they're saying, like, the critique that all the cops who in real life venerate the Punisher do is like, oh, we think it's cool that you use all this violence to get around. And like Frank just being like, no, you all clowns. It's a clown show. These repeated use of the word clown was a lot of fun. Again, it just kind of shows like, yeah, Frank uses violence and kills people and does so indiscriminately, but he also hates these assholes who are using their power and violence to inflict it upon those weaker than them. So Frank is certainly not someone to be idolized in any way, shape, or form, but especially when you idolize him, sans the context of the who he's enacting that violence against, which is very much a thing that police in real life do. So like, Frank is always been an anti-hero, but he's even a terrible person to idolize, especially if you remove the context of why he's doing this violence and who he points it at. So yeah, just an interesting element there that I loved finally that was coming back. My big worry with the show is that was never going to be addressed. I said last episode, like, I think it was implied that the task force was the ones who were the Punisher cops, and I certainly think that the show kind of at least very much alluded that with some of the visuals and stuff like that, but it was weird to me that the show had this big plot point of, oh, they use the Punisher bullets and everything, and even leading Matt to go and talk to Frank in the earlier episode this season, and it never coming back explicitly. So I appreciate that it finally gets to have like its climactic moment here. I would have been worried if that never came back up. So I like that. Ultimately, that we get here, and then we end out the episode essentially with Matt being like, all right, I'm gonna go and try to take down Fisk, and Karen being like, you can't do it. You could do it, and then you'll just die. But you need to be smarter about it. And he controls the courts. He has all this power. We need to try something else. And I think I very much really like the sentiment of what the end of the episode was trying to say, which is to say kind of what we need to be hearing right now, which is, look, fascists in power, authoritarians in power. He has the power right now, and it seems like he's won. We still have the power to fight back by, building collective action, finding the on the ground people, the people that we can fight back who are not like the system, but the collective working class or like lower class power. And I think that that's hinted at in like the BB stuff, the sort of on the street people that we talk to, and then we get this whole montage set to Radiohead. Where it's like the strong, the weak, and like the weak being the cops and the strong being the everyday citizens. I loved all of that stuff. I thought was really, really great. The one thing with that ending that kind of threw me out a little bit, and it's one of those, like, I kind of have to, it seems an unfortunate wording, because one of the things that Matt says at the end, he says, resist, what was it? It was resist something rebuild. Resist, rebel, rebuild. And I think that that's a really good sentiment. I appreciate that as like the sort of like, yeah, let's go and be anti-fascist, fight the power sort of vibe at the end. The use of the word resist, unfortunately, just again, the show didn't necessarily know in terms of like this was going to be released into the Trump 2.0 era, but it brings back to mind the hashtag resistance movement from way back during Donald Trump's first tenure in office, which we all kind of know now is very it was good at mobilizing people in terms of like getting out, but like they didn't ultimately use that energy for anything other than just performative, like we're going to wear pussy hats and say hashtag resist. It was a very performative movement that ultimately didn't get much accomplished, when what we need now is actually people going out and resisting and actually getting on the streets and fighting back, which is the energy we need right now. And I think that's the energy the show is going into. I think that it's right-headed. It's just the specific use of the word resist within the show's context and also somewhat the political context of where we're at right now. It just brought to mind the hashtag resist movement. So it's one of those, like, maybe a little bit of an unforced error by the show, but I certainly appreciate the energy. The only other critique that I would have at the end, and it kind of goes along with that sort of ACAB stuff that I was talking about earlier, is it felt weird to me that, like, we have this whole, like, yeah, we're going to fight back on the streets, and we enter the room, and it's a bunch of characters that we, for the most part, don't really care all that much about. Like, there's, the bunch of ex-cops current cops there, and also Karen, and a bartender, and it just reminded me how much like there wasn't much of a bench of supporting cast that I had a strong attachment to throughout this entire season, this first season of the show, or if you want to connect to the next show, like since the Netflix show, like it just sort of gave me this moment of like, man, yeah, they don't really have a very strong bench. And it's sort of this weird of like, yeah, look at these cops sort of abusing power. And then here's the room of like the ex-cops and cops that are the only sort of allies that Matt has. And it made me really wish for those days of like the Netflix show of like, man, it would have been really cool to see Luke Cage there, or to see Jessica Jones there. Hell, if you want to go wild with it, get a good old Tom Holland in there. Tom Holland probably would have been a stretch, but it's one of those things where it's like, Daredevil has been associated with Tom Holland. He was in the Spider-Man movie. He's associated with Jessica Jones and Luke Cage. And you can sort of like see this weird moment of like, he's sort of isolated from the old Netflix era of shows, but he's also isolated from the greater MCU when it feels like it would be natural for them to sort of be integrated in that moment. And so it kind of, the moment, like, again, you could argue with me like, yes, of course, Jessica Jones and Luke Cage wouldn't be there just logistically. Both for behind the scenes in front of the camera, probably been difficult to get the actors. Who knows if they can come back? I don't even know what the rights issues going on with that. Like, there's a lot of question marks on if they could even do that. But and certainly I understand that. So I'm like, I don't necessarily blame the show, but it was one of those moments where like when we walk into that scene and we see that visual, the lack of them there made me feel I felt their lack of presence there. And as a result, I was sort of like, look at all these cool characters we've got together to fight back. It didn't have that punch I think that the show really wanted it to have. But the sentiment is good. Like, again, and I don't want to wrap on this, like, ultimately, at the end of the day, the energy that this ends on of like things seem horrible, the guy's in charge, everything's off, like we have to fight back against Kingpin and Vanessa, like the energy that this show ends on is great and has me pumped for a season 2. So there are just some things that are like to some degree are no fault of the shows necessarily. It's part of the larger production apparatus around it that sort of lets it down a little bit, like the MCU of it all. But on its own terms, it's a strong ending that has me very pumped to go into season 2. And who knows, maybe we will get a Defenders 2.0 in that next season. Certainly they can't do much worse than what they did with the original Defenders. But yeah, it just makes me being like, man, I would love to see Jessica Jones and Luke Cage again. Maybe less so Iron Fist. I could do without him, but certainly I know the actor who played Iron Fist has spoken up recently about wanting to come back, and I haven't heard anything as much from Jessica Jones or Luke Cage's actors. But certainly those are the two that I would want much more. But again, we'll see where it goes. I think the show could still go forward without them, but it's just one of those things that like was in the back of my brain in this whole MCU of it all that sort of came up for me as I watched the ending. But that's my thoughts on this episode and this finale. This was, again, just to reiterate it, strong ending to a very up and down season, but certainly if you always want to end strong, and this has me pumped to come back for another season, and I think that is got me excited, which is much more than I expected as we were halfway through this season. So strong ending, up and down season overall, but a very, very strong ending, and I will be back for next season. But with all that said, that's everything that I have to say for this review. What did you think of the finale? I'd love to hear your thoughts, but as always, live long and prosper.